Hello, welcome to Chapter 9, the musculoskeletal system. Of your textbook, I want you to follow me starting with page 223. Last week we learned about the skeletal system. Now we're looking at the muscular system. Even though we learned about the skeletal now, the muscular system will work in tandem with the skeletal system, but we're going to separate them together. So, Chapter 9. Now let's take a look starting with the tissues because we want to, well, let's just start with the introduction just to make sure we're on the right page and the right perspective going in. Muscular tissues enable the body and its parts to move, right? We have the skeletal system that hold the framework what moves, but it's the muscle that allows the movement. The movement is caused by the ability of the muscle cells called muscle fibers to shorten and contract. We're going to go ahead as I want you to learn about this is we're going to talk about sarcomeres, and these sarcomeres are the microscopic cellular level on how this physiology, this function, this contraction happens. Muscle cells shorten by converting chemical energy obtained from food into mechanical energy, which causes movement. That's what. So we need an outside source of food, which can create calcium, ATP, and it'll create this movement on the cellular level. And then there's three types of muscle tissue in the body. So our three types of muscle tissue that you'll look at is skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. We talked about these tissues when we talked about tissues, but let's really learn. First, starting off with skeletal muscle, also called striated. Striated is because of the lines. If you actually look at what skeletal muscle looks like, let's go to page 224, figure 9-1, and look at the different muscle fibers. Once you're looking at skeletal muscle, they have a bunch of lines running through it. Those are its striations. And this is a voluntary muscle. All skeletal muscle is voluntary. It is 40% to 50% of your body weight. It's the red meat that attaches to bone. It's that protein you see in your meat. That's the muscle. Microscope reveals crosswires, stripes, or striations. Contractions can be voluntarily controlled with these. This is why if I wanted to move my arm, I let my brain know. My brain will tell my nerves to move. Then we have smooth muscle tissue. Going back to page 224, look at the way smooth muscle tissue. They almost are very squamous in look, right? But you don't have no like sticks, no rolls, no fibers. It's just very flat, but they have their nucleus. Well, smooth muscle also called non-striated, whereas skeletal muscle is called striated. So smooth muscle is non-striated and is involuntary or visceral muscle. So it lacks cross stripes or striation. So if I took a microscope, looked at it microscopically, I won't see any striation as you see from letter C in the figure. It's found on the walls of hollow visceral structures such as your digestive tract, so your guts, your colon, your intestines, your blood vessels. Why do you think when your blood pressure goes up, what causes dilate or to constrict this smooth muscle or your ureters? So involuntary visceral structures. Also contractions not under voluntary control. So movement can be caused by contraction that is involuntary. Your let's just say, like I said, going back to your vessels, whenever you need your blood pressure to go up, your vessels are going to contract. When it needs to go down, it's going to dilate. That's the smooth muscle involuntary control. So this page right here is the same page I've been referring to about from 224 of the different types of muscle tissue. Like I said, if you look at skeletal muscle fibers, A, you see that they have striations. Okay. Those are the striations, and they're cross stripes. That's what they look like. They're cross stripes. And I'll take my cursor and just point to them right here. These are your striations. Whereas right here, this is your smooth muscle tissue, like in the linings of your vessels. They're a squamous looking with the nucleus. And then you have what's different is your cardiac muscle fibers, which we will talk in its entirety once we get to the cardiac system. But I just want you to know this. Now, I want you to know the difference. You are required on testing, know the difference between the fibers. But look at the fiber. Right here is what they call these intercalated discs. Those intercalated discs are the dark bands where plasma membranes of adjacent cardiac fibers meet to each other. So that's how they start meeting. Here's another cardiac fiber. Here's another cardiac fiber. Another one. That's where all the fibers connect with each other. Then we get to the major structures of the muscle. Okay, the skeletal muscle. Each skeletal muscle is an organ composed mainly of skeletal muscle cells and connective tissue. And then, like this is most skeletal muscles extend from one bone across a joint to another. So last lecture, I talked about when you put two bones together in the joint, two bones connect to each other, that's a ligament. So when you have a bone, which this is not, let me see if it'll let me. No. A bone and a muscle, that's held together by what they call a tendon. Let's repeat this. I want this on your notes. When a bone and a muscle are held together, they are held together by a tendon. That's the connecting source. So let's look at parts of the muscle and to get it going. So when we look at parts of the muscle, we're going to start with its origin. Where it attaches to the bone that remains relatively stationary. So your bone is stationary, but where it attaches is called the origin. Okay, so you'll have your bone, and where it starts at, that's the origin, where it attaches, or fixed when the movement of the joint. So the part that doesn't move from that attachment from one bone to the other, let's just say from my humerus, which is my long arm bone, to my radius, one of the more distal bones, where the bone that almost the big long bone that connects to your thumb, there's a muscle that's going to make me do flexion. Well, my bone in my humerus, my origin, that stays the same. That's where the attachment of that, but the muscle moving the radius is my insertion. That's the point that actually moves. So the point of attachment to the bone that moves when a muscle contracts is insertion. Okay, and the body is the main part of the muscle. So if you look at your tricep, that's that big, robust, juicy part that you try to show off. But at the same time, there's an attachment bone, and then there's a movement part, which is the insertion. The attachment is the origin. So let's take a look. This is exactly what I was talking about. And you see this on your page 225, figure 9-2. Here's the origin. This is what they call your humerus, the long bone of your arm. Here's where the tendon attaches, okay? And here's the body of the muscle. And then here's your, we'll say, this is your ulna, not your radius. This is your ulna. There's the insertion point. Now, this ulna is gonna flex, but it's staying still with the origin. Here's your insertion, here's your origin, and then the muscle body is what we see. So understand the three parts in its entirety. I hope I explained that well. If not, please seek assistance and clarification during your tutoring time, because those words I want you guys to really know. You guys are going to get into your dental anatomy, and you will have to know if they ask what is the origin of the masseter bone and where is it inserted to, the origin of the masseter muscle and where is it inserted to, you will have to understand what that means. So please make sure you understand this concept. Now, muscle attached to bone by tendons. So I'm saying bone to bone is ligament. Bone to muscle is tendons. Please understand that. So strong tendons are strong cords of fibrous connective tissue. Some tendons enclosed in a synovial-lined tubes called tendon sheaths. Okay, and the tendon sheaths have lubricated by synovial fluid. Since if you have anything synovial line, it's going to create a fluid. Why? For smooth, non-abrasive movements of articulation. So bursae, also bursae or bursa, either way, tomato, tomato, are small synovial-lined sacs containing a small amount of synovial fluid as well, located between some tendons and underlying bones. People usually they get bursitis usually in these places if they get infected or inflamed. Now we're on the microscopic part, and this is the part that we have to be very detailed about. So turn to page 225 as you're looking at the figure 9-2. You're going to look at how on the right column, the second column, they show a bone, they show the fascia, the connective tissue, then it gets to the muscle fiber, then it gets down to where it's showing a sarcomere, and it's showing thick and thin filaments. That's where the magic happens. That's where the physiologically happens. But we're going to be very detailed because those right there are those bundles. As you look, like just like our nerves were built in bundles, our muscle fibers are like that too. Are intricately arranged, meaning that they have a certain detail how they're arranged. They're not just sporadic, and that arrangement helps your muscles move or act. Now, in the cellular level, as you're looking, you're going to see thick and thin filaments. Why? These filaments are made out of myofilaments. So myo, anytime you see MYO, that relates to muscle. MYO is the prefix of muscle. And I want to see if I can highlight it for you so you guys have something, but it didn't highlight. But this MIO means myo, so myofilaments. Filaments, muscle filaments. There's thick ones and thin ones. And if you look on letter A, it's showing that they contain the protein. They're made out of protein, or the thick filaments are made out of protein called myosin. So now we're getting deeper into the cellular level, and the thin ones are composed of actin. So you're going to have a myosin and an actin, or a thick and thin filament. So here's the picture I've been relating to on 225. You see, here's the whole muscle in its macro shape. Then it gets thinner. Then we get the muscle fiber. Then we get a bunch of sarcomeres. And then here we have these actin and myosin myoproteins. The thick filament is this blue one, and the thin filament is this pink one. And where they connect is called a sarcomere. So what you're going to see is when it contracts, this space that we have between it is going to shorten, and that's the contraction, and that's going to cause your muscles to move. So look, let's turn to B. B, and this is the same thing you'll see in 225. So when you're at home, really take a look at this. Here's the sarcomeres. Now here's the middle. The thick filaments are widened out here, but when they contract, they move in, and this space gets closed to have a maximum contraction in the sarcomere. Once again, here's a sarcomere. When it's open, you're relaxed. When it gets contracted, these two sarcomeres come closer, and now you have, well, the Z, so that's the Z line. The Z line is right here. I'm sorry I didn't explain that to you, but let me just clarify it. Like I said, it's going to be very, very detailed, and I want you guys to know. So each one of these sarcomeres, each repeating line where they connect is called a Z line. See how they Z? Okay, that's what that is. And those are the discs. Those are the dark intercalated bands, if you see right here, Z line. But the in between each one are called the sarcomeres. When the sarcomeres come together due to the thick and thin filaments contracting, you're going to have a contraction of the muscle. So we're deep microscopic. So let's go back. So thick and thin filaments. Thick filaments, remember again, those myofilaments are a protein called myosin, and the thin filaments are called actin, okay? So what happens is the myosin molecule, the thick filaments, okay, has a head on it. And if I can show you the little head detail right there, okay? And so what happens is it sticks out toward the actin molecule, which is the thin filament, the pink. And what happens is the actin molecule will grab it, okay, and during contraction, it'll pull it towards the middle of the sarcomere, pull it towards. So at rest, the actin is blocked, but when it gets activated, it pulls towards the middle of the sarcomere, and that's what you see here. Please review back to 225 if you guys have any questions. Hopefully I explained it right. Cengage will help you, but this is something that you have to know because this is the physiology of it, and it's hard really to explain in PowerPoint and from a video. So I want you to know when we have a contraction, follow B. You see how that sarcomere, it gets pulled towards. The heads get attached and they pull in. They meet in to the sarcomere. So, and then let's explain it from here. Basic functional contractile unit called a sarcomere. That's the contracting side. Thick and thin filaments. Sarcomeres are separate. Each sarcomere will be separated from one another by dark bands called Z lines. All right. And then it says, sliding filament model explains the mechanism of contraction. So let's explain it even more further scientifically. Thick and thin myofilaments slide past each other as muscles contract, so they close in that sarcomere. But in order for this to happen, you need calcium. And the calcium will activate so that ATP molecules can have the energy for these things to contract. So if you turn to your page 226, figure 9-4, we'll talk about the mechanism. And this is how it is. Here we are right here with the sarcomere again. So if you look at number one says a nerve impulse. So now we're using our nervous system up here. It's going to send that impulse. Remember the motor impulse? Boom, 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 boom. Saltatory conduction. It sends a nerve impulse travels to a muscle fiber through a motor neuron, triggering an electrical impulse that travels along the membrane of the muscle. So it goes down. Now it's at the membrane of the muscle. Now it's going to trigger a electrical impulse, okay? And then it says the impulse releases the calcium ions from the endoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm, right? The ER into the cytoplasm, okay? From there, the calcium ions bind the filaments and permits actin to react with myosin. So now we got a nerve impulse, electrical, telling the endoplasmic reticulum to say, hey, I need you to release calcium. Once the calcium hits the heads of what? Of the thick filament of the myosin, the heads start ratcheting, and then it pulls the thin filaments towards the middle, okay, of the sarcomere. So this is a good representation of what happens. This is what a contraction does. Okay? To add to this, in muscle tissue and other cells and muscle cells, it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But in other cells, we know it as the endoplasmic reticulum. In muscle, that same apparatus that releases the calcium is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Just want to add that caveat to it. So, muscles produce movement by pulling on one bone as the muscle contracts. So we have the origin, insertion, it's going to pull. The insertion bone is closer to the origin bone. Movement occurs at the joint between the origin and the insertion. So all these from flexion, extension, wherever the origin is going to pull. The insertion bone is pulled closer to the origin. Groups of muscles usually contract to produce a single movement. This is something we got to know. Now we're going to distinguish between how they're moved. So muscle whose contraction is mainly responsible for producing a given movement is called the primary mover. So that's the one that, hey, I'm going to move this, so I'm the primary mover. But the synergist is the muscle whose contraction helps the primary mover produce the given movement, because when you move, any type of articulation takes many muscles, but the primary one is the one that really is the responsible, but it needs a little help. So that's where it synergizes. But then, so it just doesn't move so hyper fast. You have muscles who action oppose the action of the prime mover in any given moment. That's called an antagonist. So that way you have that smooth movement. You just don't have a fast, quick articulation. So it takes all three to make a movement. So right now at your desk, I want you to flex your arm, any one of your arms, up and down. These three movers are actually happening as we're speaking. So our posture is going to take a muscle contraction. So you have good posture, muscles are contracted. That's what for posture, one of them we're going to talk about is a tonic contraction, which is tonic means tone, right? Enables us to maintain your body position. This is, well, these kind of movements don't cause movements, produce body movements, but it helps you sit upright and maintain a position. What happens, this can happen because a few muscle fibers shorten at one time and the muscle as a whole does not shorten, and so no movement occurs. So a few shorten at one time, but as a whole it doesn't move, so you don't have any movement. That's why we have posture. Good posture is optimum body position, favors the best body functioning. Skeletal muscle tone maintains a posture by counteracting with the pull of gravity. So that's a tonic contraction. Another function of the muscles, skeletal muscle, outside of movement and posture, is heat production. To survive, our body's ability to maintain a constant body temperature is important. So if we have what they call a fever or being febrile or hyperthermic, it's an elevated body temperature, often a sign of illness. Whereas hypothermia, below heat, is a body temperature below normal. So you're going to look at 98.6 Fahrenheit, and that's 37 degrees. That's our normal. When we start shifting, going higher or lower, we start pulling into these issues. Well, how does our body create heat? Contraction by contraction of muscle fibers. That produces most of our body's heat, and that's how we maintain our body temperature. And it does that by ATP transfer, and as soon as the muscle fibers contract using ATP, it produces a heat, and that's where we get our heat. So if you're cold outside, they tell you to move around. That's why sometimes you get warm if Or if you start running, you start getting hot, it's because you're using a lot of ATP, and that's the exhaust of it, creating the heat. Another function that our skeletal muscle system does is fatigue, reduced strength and muscle contraction, and that's caused by repeated muscle stimulation without adequate periods of rest. As you're constantly using ATP, ATP requires oxygen to be replenished. Once you don't have oxygen to be replenished, your body starts getting fatigued because why? With lack of oxygen will create what they call lactic acid. That's where you start feeling the pain, your muscles get fatigued. So you have to rest and restore the oxygen. That way you won't get fatigued because and if you restore oxygen, we could use ATP and our muscles can work better. Um, and like I was telling from this slide, like I told you earlier, as we use all of our oxygen up from our ATP usage, we will have lactic acid, which will create muscle burning. Also, oxygen debt is a metabolic effort required to burn excess lactic acid that may accumulate during prolonged areas of exercise. So what will happen is if you build up a lot of acid, you'll start breathing faster because your body's going to try to blow off that carbon dioxide, which is the lactic acid coming out of your blood. This also, to help that, you need to increase your oxygen intake because this increased metabolism of oxygen will cause more fatigue. I'm just reiterating that so you guys understand how this works. But that is the function of the body systems of the skeletal muscle. Now, looking at integration with other body systems, muscle functioning depends on the functioning of many other parts of the body. And let's just read as it says. Most muscles cause movements by pulling on bones across movable joints. So like last week we learned about the skeletal system. Right now we're looking at the muscle system. And remember I told you the musculoskeletal system? That's how we usually define it, but we're just separating them. It takes both of those to have any movements. Also, we talked about lactic acid and blood supply and nerves. All these play a role for our muscles to move. You need a respiratory system, not only so we can relieve carbon dioxide, but we can receive oxygen so our ATP can work. Well, how do we get oxygen from our respiratory? Well, it gets into our blood. So our blood, also we need a nervous system to activate the muscles. And then the skeletal system to get the framework so the muscles can pull. So all these things happen just to produce normal movements. Now, when we have any issues from other body systems, such as muscular sclerosis, a brain hemorrhage that can cause a stroke, a cerebral vascular accident, or a spinal cord injury, you'll have a defect or a deficiency in the way the body moves. So let's look at motor movements and how this happens, okay? If you turn to page 229, we're going to talk about motor movements, okay? So stimulation of a muscle by a nerve impulse, what? A motor nerve are required before a muscle can shorten or produce a movement. So a motor neuron is a nerve cell that transmits the impulse to the muscle, causing the contraction. So at the neuromuscular junction, just like we had the neural junction, postsynaptic cleft, and all this stuff in our nervous system, well, when it gets down to the muscle, this is the point where the nerve ending in the muscle fiber innervates. So where all that electricity gets passed down, gets to the end of the synaptic cleft, and instead of going to another dendrite, it's going to a muscle. A motor unit is a combination of a motor neuron and a muscle cell it innervates. So let's look at it. We have motor neurons touching that muscle fiber, and then, and then something's going to happen, a contraction, right? And then B, and this is all on your page 230, figure 9-4, talking about the motor neurons, where you have A is showing how the motor neuron, actually touches the muscle. But then a B is a diagram of each one, how it comes from the spinal cord. So take a look at that. That way you can familiar yourself with what's going on. A muscle will contract only if applied stimulus reaches a certain minimum level of intensity. So with this motor neuron, there's a threshold stimulus. If it reaches that threshold stimulus, you're going to have a contraction. Once stimulated by a threshold stimulus, a muscle fiber will contract completely, and a response is either all or none. It either has to go ahead and contract. If not, it's not going to contract. So that's where the neuromuscular junction comes in there. If that electricity is so strong, it's either going to contract all or one or not. That's your threshold stimulus. So different muscle fibers in the stimulus, uh, like I said, are controlled by different motor neurons having a different threshold stimulus level. So the all or none, once again, the individual muscle fibers respond to the threshold and the muscles as a whole does not. Different motor units responding to a different threshold as a muscle as a whole to execute contractions of a graded force. So basically what that's saying is they take different thresholds to make a certain muscle move. Not all muscles use the same threshold level, so that way that muscle can contract. Each one will take a different frequency of neuroactive activity so that muscle can move. That's how I translate that, and that's how you should know. Now, let's look at the different muscle contractions. We talked about posture and how that contracts, that tonic contraction. Let's look at other types, okay? We'll look at 4 different types. And you will have to know that. We have a twitch contraction. When a twitch contraction happens, it's a quick, jerky response to a stimulus. So you're going to get a stimulus, on, it's going to twitch, okay? Also, we're going to get a tetanic contraction. You may have heard somebody having tetanus. That's when it's sustained contraction. So say if you guys flex your muscle and you keep it that way, you're in what they call tetany. So that's sustained and steady muscular contraction caused by a series of stimulating, bombarding muscle rapid succession. That means that the impulses are just keep hitting that muscle. Contract, 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 contract. The next contraction we have is called an isotonic contraction. That's something that we're normally doing. For example, lifting this book requires uh, lifting, a flexion, and extension. Well, what isotonic contractions, what you get is a contraction that produces movement of a joint. And what happens is the muscles will change its length, causing your insertion of it, the end, and the insertion muscle to move to the point of origin. So you have that. Well, those isotonic contractions are broken down to 2 subtypes. We have eccentric contraction, allows muscles to increase in length, and we have concentric, which causes it to shorten, length to shorten. What did I say? Flexion, extension. We do this all the time. Like I said, if you guys were to grab your book, your textbook, and bend at your biceps and your elbow, it will flex and it'll extend. That's what we call muscle contraction. Really means pulling of the muscle, whether it shortens or not. Okay? Other things like walking, running, lifting, twisting, and most body movements are examples of isotonic contractions. Now we look at isometric contractions. There are these are contractions where the muscle contractions do not produce a movement, but we are contracting. The muscle as a whole does not shorten and it doesn't move, right? So when you hear the word isometric, that's a Greek word, means equal measure. So let's just say I'm pushing up against a wall, or I'm doing a push-up and I stop and hold a plank. That's called an isometric contraction. This is where it happens, where tension within the muscle increases, but it doesn't produce a movement because the muscle does not shorten. Okay, so it's isometric. It stays equal. So here's an example of that. And you can find this on page 232, figure 9-7. So isotonic, like we do. This guy's flexing and extending the muscle. Eccentric is when the muscle lengthens. So, and uh, concentric is when the muscle shortens. So if I want to do extension, I'm eccentric. If I want to do concentric, is when I flex. When I flex it, as concentric. Now let's go. So isotonic, same tension, changing length. Whereas isometric, it stays the same. For instance, like I said, we're doing a push-up and we hold a plank, or we're pushing up against the wall. We're going to hold it there. We're not going to create any movement, but we're going to cause tension, same length of changing tension. Types of movements we talked about earlier, even in the skeletal system. Flexion, movement that increases the angle by two bones at the joint. Bending, extension, it's straightening because it increases the angle between two bones at the joint. So this is also in your book, page 233, figure -9-9. You do need to know how to distinguish each one of these movements. Flexion, extension. These are what they call isotonic movements. Look even on your lower extremity. You have your quadricep and you have your hamstrings. Extension, you're kicking out. Flexion, you're pulling your leg back in. Isotonic movements. So the type of movements that produce skeletal muscle contractions, we talked about this earlier, or not earlier, but last week in the skeletal system. Now, skeletal muscle does the same thing. Abduction. Remember being abducted, you're taken away from the midline of the body. When you add ADD, you bring it back. You rotate and you circumduct, so movement around the longitudinal axis. So go ahead and turn to your page 234 and see figure 9-10. That will explain those, give you a picture of that. There's also one called pronation and supination. Supine is the anatomical position. So what does that mean? Your hands, your palms are facing outward. So hand positions that result from rotation of the forearm. Supination, hand position with the palms turn to the anterior position. And pronation, where you turn palms face down or your palms face posterior. Those are the movements called pronation and supination. I think about that, supination anatomical, but pronation, you ever been prone to something, being in a prone position where you're laying on your stomach? Well, your palms, when they're turned in, that's a pronating movement. Then we have what they call dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Those deal with our feet. Dorsiflexion results in elevation of the dorsum, the top of the foot. So when you think about the top of the foot, and you could take a look at this in what they call on page 234, figure 9-10, they're going to talk about dorsiflexion. So look at F. Your toes are moving upward. Where plantar flexion, your toes are moving downward. Your plantar flexion. So here's the figure I'm talking about from that page. Take a look at them. Here's another one. We're talking about dorsiflexion, plantarflexion. We're also talking about eversion and inversion. Please know the difference. All these movements are what you guys are going to have to know, but please don't be afraid of these. We have a table, okay? So in the table, they're going to talk about muscles that flex, extend, and move. I'm not going to grade you on the muscles that are group function, but I will test you on what a circumduction is, a pronation, an adduction, an abduction, a rotation, an inversion, an eversion. So please know these movements. So here's your general musculature. This is all the muscles in the body. So many. If you look at all these muscles, you may get overwhelmed. Well, it's okay. I am not going to test you on all these muscles. Why? Because you are dental hygienists. But I will want you to be very versed on are your cranial muscles or your facial muscles, because that is your wheelhouse where you work at. So you must know all your facial muscles. So let's look at the muscle groups of the head and neck. And you can refer to the pages 236 and 237. 237 especially because they have exactly what you look for. Your table, we eat on your table. You must know all this table. So make your index cards now because you will be tested. I want you to make your index card just like table 9-2 says on page 237, muscles of the head and neck. You must know what muscle, their function, where it's inserted, and where it's their origin. And what muscles do we have? Well, we have the frontal, the orbicularis oculi. What does that sound like? Anything with the eyes. Orbicularis iris, those are eye muscles. Your zygomaticus. Until you remember our zygomatic bone, well, we're thinking of cheeks, right? So what that does, it elevates the corners of the mouth and lips. Your masseter, that's a big one for you guys to know. It's your jaw muscle, closes it, and the insertion point is the mandible and zygomatic arch. And your temporal closes your jaw as well. Your sternocleidomastoid bone, sternum, clavicle, mastoid flexes your head, makes you say yes, yes, ma'am, or no. Your trapezius elevates the shoulder, extends to your head. Please know all the muscles, including the function, insertion, and origin of the muscles of the head and neck. This is something that you'll know. As you get to head and neck anatomy, they're going to get a little bit more detailed about it, but this is how you create your foundation. And you'll be quizzed every quiz from now on with it. So on your midterm so far, you will have to know these muscles. Easy way to learn, go to page 237, look at table 9-2, and also look at where they're located because you will have to locate them on the same page 237, figure 9-12. You'll be surprised where they correlate since last week we learned about the bones of the skull. You'll be surprised where they locate. Here's a picture of the one I'm talking about. Look at it. You have your frontal, temporal. Look at that masseter muscle. That masseter muscle is a good muscle to know. Why? You guys are dental hygienists. What closes your jaw? Uh, your masseter. Why? Because it's inserted into the mandible, but it starts in this zygomatic arch here. And then so on and so forth. So take your table and take this picture and really get used to it. Learn it. Now, these muscles, I'm not going to test you on your skeletal muscle groups of the upper extremities. I'm not going to test you on that because you're a dental hygienist. If you were a different medical discipline, I make you know. But I just want you to look at it so you can survey it and see all the muscles. Your pecs, you guys all know that. Your lats, extend your upper arm. Those are those nice wings they call it for some of you gym heads. Your deltoids, if you look at your arm, that's that picture frame where a lot of you guys like to get your tattoos. Your biceps, that's the big nuggets in front of your arm. Your triceps in the back. Anytime you hear the word ceps, because your biceps had two heads, triceps have back. One's anterior, one's posterior. You have abdominal muscles. And then we'll talk when we get to respiratory, we're going to talk about the muscles of the intercostal muscles in between your ribs. And then you have your diaphragm. That helps you breathe. That helps you sing. I can't do it right, but that's what that's for. So here's the muscles of the trunk. Just a little survey. Then we get to our lower extremity. We're just surveying these ones. The ipsopsoas flexes your thigh. Your gluteus maximus extends your thigh. That's the big booty meat. Your abductor muscles and your hamstring. So those are the back of your thighs. So just some survey of that. Like I said, and then quadriceps. You have your tibialis, your gastrocnemius. That's what gets plantar flexion. And fibrillaris group, it flexes your foot. So just to reiterate, the muscles of the head and neck you're required to know. The rest of the muscles are, I just wanted you to survey them, to just look at them. We'll be testing on the muscles of the head and neck. So once again, please refer to page 237, table 9-2 and figure 912 to really help you study for those. We will always have on our quizzes and our tests our cranial nerves, our cranial muscles of the skull, and head and neck muscles and the cranial bones. So please make sure you know those. Now let's look at what major disorders, some what they call myopathies. Myo still, the root word for muscle, path meaning diseases. Those are muscle disorders that can range from mild to life-threatening. Okay, so that's whenever you hear anything with a myopathy, just know that's some kind of disorder, some kind of disease that dealing with the muscles. I'm not going to really go deep into them because you guys are you'll have more of this as you go, but let's just take a look. Now first, for a muscle injury, so I want you to know this word, strain. Our muscles been strained. That's an injury from overexertion or trauma. It involves stretching or tearing of muscle fibers. So when you strain it, it's overexertion. So when you usually have it, you usually have myalgia, which is muscle pain, and you're going to get myositis, which is where it'll get inflamed. And if it really is bad and it hurts the tendon, you can have fibromyositis. So if injury is near a joint and involves ligament damage, it is called a sprain. So we went from a strain to a sprain if it involves the ligament damage. Also, cramps. Those are painful muscle spasms, which are involuntary twitches. Remember we talked about twitches earlier? Involuntary. You can have cramps. With crush injuries, they result from severe muscle trauma and may release cell contents, and that can cause kidney failure. Those ones like that, if you hear the rhabdomyolysis, that's one of them. You tear your muscle and all the potassium's leaking into your bloodstream. It's your kidneys. Start shutting things down. You're going to learn that the kidneys are the divas of the body. They can't handle much. Most of your stuff in your body is very resilient. They'll fight for you. Your kidneys have a threshold that say, bye, Felicia. So that's why we call them the divas. And then also stress-induced muscle tension can cause headaches and back pain. Some muscle infections, since you guys are microbiology and know this, bacteria, viruses, and parasites can affect the muscles. Poliomyelitis is one. It's a viral infection of the motor nerves to your muscles, and it can be life-threatening. Why? Because they can shut down your muscle activity, then you won't be able to breathe. The last myopathy I want to talk about is an autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis. Myasthenia gravis is produces muscle weakness and fatigue, especially in the face and the throat. Um, and they'll start out mild, but as it gets chronic and severe, you can get into a myasthenic crisis where it shuts down your respiratory muscles and prevents you from breathing, which you die, right? So that is the end of this lecture. Couple things to help you, because this stuff will be on your midterm. Midterms were 30% of your grade. 15% of your grade. Your post-lab assignments for Chapter 9 musculoskeletal system will only be the sin gauge stuff. That'll be in your lab. Now, but if you look under post-lecture assignments, you'll see what we have is a knowledge facilitation document. I'm not going to give you an assignment to turn in to help you but because you know how my assignments are quiz reviewed, but I compiled a document called a knowledge facilitation. The components of this knowledge facilitation document are going to direct you on how to study for the midterm of this. As you know, required, just dealing with the musculoskeletal system alone, or the muscle system alone, um, the head muscles of the head and trunk, please make sure you make your 5x9, 3x5 cards, or whatever it is, and know those. But if you look in the post-lecture assignments, you do have some assignments in there that are due on the 16th. Those assignments deal with the skeletal system. Those are going to help you review for your midterm. So do your assignments, do them right, and you will have your assignments quiz reviewed. So this is going to help you get right for the midterm. Also, your midterm will compose of everything since week 1. So look over all your old assignments of week 1, and then your knowledge facilitation from today for chapter 9, and all your skeletal system assignments. So please get ready for next week on the 16th to do our midterm. If you have any questions, please go to your tutoring session. Thank you.